and welcome back to the education track of PyCon AU 2025. Woo! I am really excited to be joined by Geoff today. Now, Geoff, this is his first PyCon. What a way to do it. Just,
right?
Commit and present. Fantastic. That's what we want here, more suckers. Geoff is a passionate public school teacher who enjoys coding for work and pleasure. He currently works as the head of middle years and also the STEM and data leading teacher. He's a mad Richmond supporter and spends the rest of his energy as the father of 3 girls. Can I get a massive welcome for Geoff? Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. I put my QR code for the slides at the front because maybe after you get to the end you won't want them anymore. So thanks so much for coming along to hear about my little experimentation with some fun technology and some, I was going to say smelly teenagers, but after the code of conduct I feel like I'm not supposed to say that. But so this is me. I've been a teacher in Victorian public schools for a touch over 15 years. I currently work at Heathmont College, which is in the outer east of Melbourne, mostly teaching digital technologies and applied computing, that sort of thing, as well as a little bit of pinch hitting in maths from time to time. I came to teaching after a few years as a Java developer and Oracle app server administrator. And once I got into schools, had to trek through teaching students VB6 and PHP before eventually finding my way to a lovely language like Python, which I've been using for about the last 7 or 8 years. So plan today, just a little bit of a quick, why bother with Streamlit? Why might you want to have a crack at that? Bit of a chat about how we played around with some setup with Github Codespaces in Classroom that have both got sort of some pros and cons to them. How do we actually use it with students? And then a few takeaways so that the mistakes I made won't be the same as the mistakes you might make. And you can make your own new ones. So obviously, with any sort of extra technology you're going to bung in the classroom, there really wants to be the question of why would you bother with that? I don't have any association with Streamlit or Snowflake, the crew who sort of own it. I just really like it. How many people, if I can just get a quick show of hands, because I'm still a school teacher, how many people have heard of Streamlit before? Yep, so that's probably most. How many have played around with it? Yeah, okay, so a few but not most. So Streamlit is primarily a tool for data people, data scientists, analysts, engineers, to rapidly build web apps and dashboards, is my understanding. Seems to have been finding a little bit of traction because it makes it really easy to create something quite visual and interactive with not too much code. You might have heard of maybe Dash or Gradio or Panel, which are in a pretty similar sort of space with their own little quirks. I get excited about it because it works as a really low floor, high ceiling type tool. It's really easy to get started with, but you can certainly get pretty complex pretty quick if you put your mind to it. So still the question of why bother? And for me, in public, I love a text-based interface. You probably love text-based interfaces. My students love a text-based interface for about a lesson, and then it starts feeling a bit disconnected from their life. Once they feel like they're not a hacker anymore, it sort of loses some sheen. And it's not just about some sheen, but creating things that they sort of feel connected with and that they feel is part of what makes sense for them. I'm also a really big believer that by senior high school, for lots of my kids who have found their thing, building a project that can be put out there on the web and demonstrate some skills that are maybe unique, or at least show that they've got something that's pretty marketable is a really worthwhile endeavour for them. They might not be knocking back their Macca's shifts straight away, based on the few lessons I've got with them. But the truth is that plenty of these kids are more than capable of creating work that has some value for small businesses in their orbit that might potentially be a big part of what they want to have a bash at. And if that's not them, then at least having something they can show mum and dad, or that I can show mum and dad on parent-teacher interviews, can be a bit of a motivator too. So with this sort of mindset of making something a bit visual, we sort of have just worked our way through. We've done our second program, and big surprising, we've gone from Hello World to Hello Bob or Mary or Mum or Bill, and we want to create something that's a tiny bit graphical. You might end up with code that looks like this. Now, it's probably a little bit cheeky to be using TK-Into, which is not everyone's least complex way of creating a GUI, but it possibly makes the point that if I want to use code like this, I've got a choice of either doing a lot of teaching, doing a lot of working our way to getting there, finding out what a callback means, using a layout manager, or I'm going to wave my hands around and go, you just have to trust me on all this bit, and you can just plug and play with the little bits. Whereas what excited me about Streamlit is that if I'm taking my same program and wanting to do that in Streamlit, I've got code here that I can explain really well, right? I can go, I'm more than happy to explain to them that we're importing a library and we're giving it an alias of ST, and that from there, that has some functions in it called title, called text input that's going to give them a value back, so on and so forth. That feels really achievable, but even more, it feels really extendable too. My students understand every part of that, can understand every part of that, and so they can then, when their imagination gets a bit inspired, are able to sort of, this is a playground, and suddenly we've got a playground space to mess around with, and that's really exciting, especially because I'm working in classes where I've got wildly varying levels of ability and interest. So here I've got a more complex example. I just really wanted to show off this one because this was a really quick. I had a year 9 student. This was part of my inspiration for trying the Streamlit thing a little bit harder, because I had one of my year 9 students who was in my game design course, and they created all these beautiful assets, beautiful images that all needed to be scaled down because they were all created too big because they hadn't thought about how it was going to look on a screen. And they're like, how can I quickly resize 20 different images? And I said, oh look, I'm sure there's a tool on the web for it. And we opened one up and got accosted by about 12 different ads. And I thought, okay, maybe let's put that away. You go home, and by the time you get home, I'll have one sitting in your email inbox. And I mean, I wasn't being assessed. I definitely used AI to help me out a little bit here. But again, some really quite understandable code if you've got the time and you're not trying to read it at the back on a screen that's not big enough for it. I mean, it's a pretty big screen. I shouldn't be complaining. But yeah, that sort of was part of being inspired. This is something that kids can actually really get some value out of. And so this accepts a huge amount, drag and drop your images there. It'll tell it what size you want it, and away you go. So, I mean, I guess what you maybe see there is you don't see a lot of Streamlit in there, and because Streamlit mostly just gets out of the way. That's why I got excited about it. You create UI components by calling a function that gives you the input value back. The app runs from top to bottom, and the whole script will rerun every time you've got input. That's really easy to understand. If you want to do more complex handling, there's ways to do that. It can be a bit funky once you get into that, but that's a really simple transition from text-based programming. The Streamlit's stuff is quite opinionated in how it looks. Most Streamlit apps look like Streamlit apps, but that actually has got a bit of an advantage because the kids who get the most excited about, I just need this to look exactly like I want, are also the kids who I need to give stuff to do so that they're not going too far ahead of everyone, and are ready to take on a bit of additional challenge. Because it's built for data apps, it works really well with the plotting and data libraries, so your matplotlibs and your plotlibs and blah, 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 and pandas, etc. Uses Altair in its built-in plotting libraries, which are good to just sort of get things going. And really, when I'm teaching programming to secondary students, the most important thing is really about the focus wants to be on the algorithm and the data analysis and the program concepts. I don't want them focused on how good the product looks, and something like this does a good job of giving in a little bit, giving them something that they appreciate and like without that being the sort of the real focus of where they're putting their energy. So in terms of setup, we had a real run at playing around with this with Codespaces in classrooms. So GitHub Codespaces gives you a full VS Code environment running on a mini server through the browser. So it sits on the cloud and it's all kind of nice. I haven't done enough investigation into understanding what dev containers are properly and how I might be configuring them. But because Streamlit's community cloud, they're sort of sharing, share your app sort of system uses Codespaces, I was able to create an app there, steal their config, and that made it all nice for my students, which was kind of nice. Because their kids are starting up a virtual machine of their own, it's super safe. It's not going to mess around with anything on their computers, and I didn't have to install anything on their computer, which is really nice. But then it also takes a bit of time to start up. And if, as I say, in classes like mine, I've got some students whose interest levels are not super high, and if we're 10 minutes in before we realise we haven't started up the code space, adding another 5 minutes to that can be disappointing. GitHub Classroom is all about sort of making sure we can distribute a template repository to the students and track how they're going. Because set up the code space stuff in there, it does a really good job of keeping that, and it means that once my template repository is all set up, they don't have to fork a template, add me as a collaborator, make sure it's set to private, all that sort of stuff. All that that gets taken care of, and that was really kind of handy. You do want to have a GitHub education account or a GitHub teacher account to be able to run that. And if you are a teacher and you're eligible for that, it is worth getting, even if you have no intention of running this stuff, because it's just nice to get free stuff as a teacher. That doesn't happen that often. So in terms of my crew, the crew I ran this with first, I had a Year 10 Digital Technologies class with a wide variety of abilities. I've said that already, haven't I? They were all males. I've been hearing about all girls schools all day so far, and they're all males in some fairly stereotypical groups for themselves. I had a sporty group of AFL boys that I got on really well with, but they were less excited about doing the programming, and I had a bit of a set of gamer types. Sometimes these kids just stereotype themselves, but most had never done much coding, which was surprising getting to Year 10, but sort of that's what it was. Now, it got a little bit more complicated because my first 2 weeks, plan was to sort of start with this in the subject. My first 2 weeks, I was off on long service leave. I think actually watching a bunch of PyCon videos while I was sitting by a pool in Noosa. But students were theoretically working their way through some Python basics in Grok Academy, and while a bunch of them made some really good progress, a bunch did not. And regardless and foolishly, we set off on getting into Streamlit straight away from there. So Classroom allocated the template to them. We had these 5 pages set up. The file naming is weird here, and that's because that's how sort of Streamlit's old version of the page setup works. You don't have to do it like that anymore. You can set your own titles, I think, now if you do it that way, but it broke my heart to be capitalizing code files, but here we are. So the first one was just, it's the one that you can sort of see a little bit of here, was let's get some stuff on the screen and see what that looks like, do a tiny bit of layout in terms of a couple of columns, put an image in there, and then play around with it and make that about yourself. And then we sort of built from there. We did some processing input, so take a number and do something useful with it. If you're struggling a little bit, then that's going to be running a really straight up formula. If you're doing a little bit better, that was use a loop to make that a bit more exciting and that sort of thing. We did some graphing, and then graphing and some interactive graphing. So we played with, first of all, was a data set on gaming consoles, I think, and then Kane Lambert's career AFL stats, because as I said, I'm a bit of a Tigers. I'm sure there's not that many people who know who Kane Lambert is in the room, but they were working their way through some AFL stats, and then using live data with some APIs, some free APIs around, and that was sort of the structure we had a bash at. You're very welcome to find your way to the repository, but there's probably better things to do with your time. So how did it go? Mostly okay, which is possibly not the ringing endorsement you're hoping for when you hear a talk here. But so I'd better have learned a fair bit as a result. So absolutely, I had a group of students that this worked really well for, and they did run with it. the tipping point really centered around that idea of, have you built up the mental model for what is actually going on here? Have you built up those Python basics so that any of the rest of this makes some sense? What I did see was that for my weaker students, they generally found an activity in there that they connected with. So for quite a few of them, that was the API. For others, they got quite excited about making a graph that changed when you had some interactivity to it. Some just got excited about shoving a whole bunch of stuff on their front page. So the infuriating part was I ultimately feel like I'd created Streamlit tasks rather than creating Python tasks, that my tasks were a bit too Streamlit shaped. I let the medium become the message, or however that works. And it's a really easy trap to fall into when we're playing with shiny new toys and we forget why it's there in the first place. Back the other way though, APIs are really cool and a really fun way to get kids up and going. I got inspired by the Teaching Python podcast crew who you raved about how important it was to be teaching every kid to use APIs. My experience with Codespaces was a bit of a mixed bag. Part of that was even just that. Got some year 10s are often rocking 4-year-old laptops that were the absolute base model at the starting point, and they're quite often 11-inch screens, which are just not enough to be running a VS Code window that's inside a browser. It was just a bit excessive. And then given that, it looks like VS Code's heading in terms of into a pretty hard Copilot integration sort of end, that overwhelm, probably a bit much for year 10s in the end. I went around again because why not be a sucker? And this was with my VCE data analytics class. And in that course, the focus is on it's in the name, focus is on the data analysis. And so Streamlit was really built for that work pretty well. I was cheating a little bit. There's not so much of a code focus in the course, but I had a group of students who had either done Year 12 software development the previous year or were going to be doing it next year, and so that sort of worked a bit more okay there. And we ultimately have created some pretty fun interactive visualizations. So yeah, they went a little bit better. For those who had some of that programming experience, they used templates and the sample code and sort of modified from there. And that sort of really helped build some familiarity without necessarily them having a complete understanding of what was going on. And one thing that really stood out was that those interactivity features, the sort of relative ease with which, because it refreshes the whole page every time you change some input, they were pretty simple and easy to understand. And so I don't think my students necessarily really realised just how much work might have gone into that otherwise if we weren't using a tool that sort of worked like that. So I've got some takeaways that really sort of came out. The first one is that it's a bit embarrassing to be a 15-year Digitech teacher and be still making this one, but my excitement about moving us through to the next thing left too many floundering, which is just real silly. And getting this thing is more important than the next thing we've got to learn. And so that was, as I say, a little bit embarrassing, but fortunately I hit it well and didn't tell anyone about it, so it's going great. I also very clearly suffer from GeoCities syndrome. Now, some people, most of the people in here, it seems, possibly are too young to understand what GeoCities is, but it was, I grew up in the age of the internet where the idea of being able to get your own site that you've coded yourself up online was just the coolest thing. And I still have that somewhere deep inside me as a core conviction that is just really cool. And my kids do find it cool, but not that cool. They don't have that same experience. And so that's one to watch out for. I think, where I think this is sort of more exciting is at the broader, more abstract sort of picture. The marriage of Python and data science communities feels like it can only be really positive for those of us who are teaching young people to code. The Venn diagrams of needs of the data science community and education is really, really strongly overlapping. So whether it's Streamlit, I've been really enjoying playing around with, I haven't tried with students yet, but playing around with Marimo notebooks, another one that is out there that's just real fun. These are worth us exploring as educators because even when they're not primarily built for our students, there is just a ton of overlap there. And look, I mean, it's not just data science. There is just value in playing with the new toys with your students. Another key takeaway was that my students knew I really wanted them to commit their work, but they didn't know why they should care about it. And I didn't put that groundwork in. And without those basics, they sort of missed the point. And so lots of the advantages of GitHub Classroom disappeared for me because I had students who looked like they had not made any progress over the entire course. And for some of them, it wasn't a lot, but there was, yeah, the benefit there really wasn't there. And also, it's a useful thing for my students to get the hang of. I was really frustrated that I hadn't put that groundwork in. I'm just a huge fan, to be honest. So it was really lovely hearing Renee before because it was her talk about GitHub in 2023, finding that on YouTube that got me all excited about having a go at Codespaces and playing around with Classroom and all that sort of stuff. So I just love the openness of this conference. I love that in a week or so's time, these talks will be up online. And I think for, I'm a public school Digitech teacher who's got a bunch of other jobs. My chance to sort of be here is really lovely, but I think the resource is just enormous. So I'm really grateful for that. So look, in terms of what I do next time, I'm not 100% sold on the Codespaces thing. And I think for some of my students, the mental model of losing the connection with the work they were doing was a little bit more difficult. So when I ran it with my Year 12s, lots of my Year 12, I gave them the option and lots of them chose to use Codespaces on their own computers, and I found that that keeping them to that model that they understood a little bit better of seeing the files on their hard drive actually sort of had them feeling a little bit safer with things. But the more important part was really about making sure that, when we run it next time, we'll be making sure that we get a much more Python first sort of focus. And in terms of what I'd like you to with Streamlit, I'm more than happy to advocate for the tool. It's a really cool tool. It's worth having a play around with. Even if you do it really low level. They've got a WebAssembly or whatever it is. So they've got a ST-Lite, so you can even play around on the playground where it's a step down from worrying about a Codespaces. So it's a really natural progression from some simple scripts, and there's just lots of potential there. More broadly, you probably heard the excitement in that overlap of needs between data science and education, and seeing that get explored further, and play around with new toys. I think one of the beautiful things about being a digital technology teacher, teaching kids to program, is the chance that you pretty much almost always have to do a little bit of learning alongside. And that's a nice way to teach, and it's a really cool thing when that is what happens in your classroom. So the frequency of that, I think, is really worth embracing, and it's a cool thing. That's about it. Thanks.